Merritt K, welcome to Redacted Island.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I found you on a Dazed article because you have a book coming out called LAN Party, and it looks pretty tight. And then I went a little deeper into your work, and I saw that you write video games and interactive fiction and other wild short stories that tap into nostalgia and outer worlds and a type of kind of retro-techno escapism that I feel like is really unique. And yeah, I'm excited to chat. So what is LAN Party?
Yeah, so LAN Party is a photo book of LAN parties, which for people who don't know, LAN stands for local area network. And it's, as opposed to like a distant network, it's you're connecting computers together in a closed network. And so LAN Party, I mean, they still happen. We're most prominent in like the 90s and 2000s and sort of into the 2010s. And basically the idea was you would bring a bunch of computers to one place, hook them up to each other, and then play games together or share files or just hang out. This is sort of pre-high-speed internet, or at least before most people had access to it. You couldn't really do file sharing in the way that we do today. You couldn't really do online games in the way we do today. So this was the best way to do that, was to actually transport your stuff to the same physical space. And the irony is that computers were much bigger at the time. So CRT monitors were the norm, and those things were quite big, and they're like a tube television, basically. And yeah, they were this interesting moment in time. And like I say, they still happen. There are still huge LAN events that happen primarily in Europe, but the era of the small, a bunch of people bringing their stuff over to someone's house is mostly over just because of how convenient online access is today.
Yeah, LAN parties are so fascinating because now when we're gaming, you're not in a room with anyone. So you don't get to see the reaction of if you like frag someone. In Call of Duty, maybe they'll say that you get like 1 second of the person yelling if they die or whatever. But like for a LAN party to be hooked up to 4, 8, whatever, 10 other computers, it's you really get to feel when you do something in a game that is worth reacting to.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I guess the other thing that's so crazy about it is like bringing your computer to a place. It's not like just going over to play like Sega or Xbox, because you're hauling it over and it takes time to set something up and like really get into it. It's like you're dedicating a serious amount of time to playing and locking yourself in the room and like really focusing in. It's not just a casual game. It's like a weekend.
Yeah, there's a lot of pictures in the book. It looks like a disaster scene where there's just like energy drinks strewn everywhere. There's a lot of pictures of people like in sleeping bags under desks and stuff. Even at the big events, sometimes people would just like sleep at their seat. So yeah, I mean, it was an event, right? It was like something where you had to commit to it. And I set up this tension in the book between the trade-offs of convenience and control with technology, where LAN parties weren't really convenient. They took a lot of work, but at the same time, people had a lot more control over their experiences with games, with technology. And we've seen computing just become so mundane, so everyday over the last 20 years. And in a way that's great because it's very convenient to have a smartphone with Google Maps, with always on internet connection, with all kinds of stuff. But in another way, we've lost a lot of control. So specifically with games, like more and more games now are server side. So the infrastructure for them is all owned by the company, the publisher, the developer. And that can be convenient in a lot of ways, but it also means that people don't have as much control over their experiences. And actually, the other day, I think it was an Ubisoft executive who was saying something like, we have to get people used to not owning their games, which they're putting it in the context of, oh, people have gotten used to this with music and movies, so we need to get people used to this with games, and people reacted really badly to it. But I see that coming, right? There's already services that provide that kind of thing. So it's tough, right? Because it's this trade-off of it's more convenient to do a lot of things online today, but We don't have as much control over them. We don't have as much privacy. So that's something that I think gets overlooked a lot of the time.
Yeah, the LAN party seemed like such a closed circuit. Like everything was within the control of the people in the room. And the only thing that mattered was what was happening in the room. In that way, it blocks everything else out. You don't have to worry about your internet connection. I remember someone had installed Counter-Strike on the computer lab in like my elementary school. And as soon as I found out that I could play against other people, computer class just wasn't the same.
Yeah.
It felt like so forbidden to be able to like interact with the people in the same room without the computer teacher like spying on us or like catching us. It was like the most exhilarating thing. It was the first time I had ever done anything like that.
Yeah. We set up some kind of like instant messaging system on our school's computer lab when I was in junior high as well. And yeah, that was like, I think that got shut down pretty quick when the teacher found out. But it was cool, right? It was like, wow, you can be in the same room communicating through this technology, through the mediation of technology. Now we can do that. Like right now, we're talking over an internet connection. We're in different parts of the world. And that is really cool too. I think there are some things that are lost, right? I don't play a lot of games online for a bunch of reasons. I'm not a very competitive person, or I guess I am, which is the problem. I tend to get too invested in things. So I'm not really to do that. It's pretty well documented that no matter who you are, and it's worse if you're a certain type of person, but the atmosphere in online games is like awful a lot of the time.
Right.
It's extremely like toxic. It's the internet anonymity thing. And that kind of thing is naturally curbed if you're in the same room, because even if you don't know the people super well, you can only say something so shitty before someone is just going to deck you, right? So it's a different kind of experience.
Yeah. So we're talking like 2000, 2001?
Yeah, LAN parties, they come out of the demo scene. The demo scene is like the antecedent to LAN parties, where people were mainly just working on their own programs or doing like computer art. And LAN parties really start to pop off in the late 90s, early 2000s, because that's when you start getting the first person shooter as like the dominant genre of computer game. So Doom obviously is a huge deal. And for a while, these games are just called Doom clones. And you're starting to get 3D graphics in the late 90s. And these really like fast games like Quake or Half-Life. But the problem is you don't have high-speed internet connections to be able to play them at low latency online. So that's when LAN parties really start to pop off. And a lot of the pictures that I have in the book are from the 2000s. And there's a fair amount from the 2010s as well. People were still doing a lot of this into the 2010s. And obviously it got a little easier when people had flat screens instead of CRTs. And even laptops, like gaming laptops, start to become a thing in the late 2000s. And there's a few in the book from the last couple of years as well. Just some people still do it who were doing it like 20 years ago. And what's interesting to me is that there are some like younger people who are like in their early 20s and weren't around for kind of the heyday of it, but are like, oh, that sounds great. I would love to be in the same room as my friends and not just like on a Discord call. People in that generation have been doing them lately as well.
That's sick. It's really funny meeting people who look back at the 90s but have never lived through it, but see it through rose-colored glasses.
Yeah.
It's like thinking about living in the 70s and talking to your parents and having your perception of the 70s be much different than what they were thinking. It's just funny. It's only now that we're able to meet the people that want to live the nostalgia of computer era that they haven't been able to live in.
Yeah, no, it's funny. I think every generation deals with this in their own way. I think it's maybe a little different for millennials because we're sort of the first generation to grow up en masse online. Gen X people were on the internet as well, but a lot of people I know or at my age were on it in their teens and like even earlier and sort of grew up with the internet as it morphed from Web 1.0 to 2 to whatever it is now. And it's funny though to meet people who are like, oh, I wish I could have been around in the Y2K era. It was so cool. And I'm like, or they'll look at pictures in the book and be like, oh, I was born in the wrong decade. And I'm like, this is the thing that you are like that about. Like, but then I'll look at pictures of New York in the 70s and be like, oh my God, damn, that would have been so cool. And I know people who lived through it and were like, yeah, it was cool in some ways, but also like it was shitty in other ways too. And I mean, the people who idolize Y2K are really funny to me because it's in many ways that was a truly horrible time to be in America or Canada even. It was really scary. Like, post 9/11 was like a bad time for a lot of people. And that doesn't come up as much. And, you know, that's always like that. We glaze over the parts of the past that we don't identify with.
Yeah, like Times Square in the 70s through photos. The sleazy Times Square is like really, it's like lionized. And then
absolutely,
the people that were like living in New York in the 70s have a completely different experience. Or Needle Park, like it was just a completely different thing. I think about the early to mid 90s of being like the heyday of cyberpunk and going into what cyberspace was going to look like. And I watched a little video that you had on YouTube about MUDs, which came around the same, a little bit earlier than the LAN parties, but that was a groundbreaking thing at the time. Do you think you could talk a little bit about MUDs?
Yeah, MUDs are really interesting to me. They were like, it's funny you say cyberspace. I feel like that's a term we heard so much in the 90s and just fell off because to me, it's because the internet isn't really a space anymore. Like it used to be a place you go to and there were like doors that you opened to go into it, like your home computer. And now it's infected reality. So it's just another layer on top of physical life. But MUDs, the MUDs were the topic of a lot of research in the 80s and 90s about cyberspace and about like interactions through technology. And they varied a lot, but for people who don't know, it stands for multi-user dungeon. And basically, they could be anything from a vaguely themed chat room to like a built out world where you could wander around, like a multiplayer version of a text-based game. And people formed communities in them. People were building these interesting spaces and they got supplanted over time as technology improved. We got MMOs, which games like World of Warcraft, which are graphical, and those became much more popular than MUDs really ever were. But it's a different kind of experience, right? In a graphical game, you're limited a little more by your eye is drawn more to the world as it's been presented to you. Whereas in a MUD, there was a lot more role playing, a lot more projecting your imagination onto the kind of skeleton of the world that you had, which was basically just text. And there are some that are still around, but for the most part, they not nearly as popular as they were even in the early 2000s when I was on them. I think they were already starting to decline back then, but definitely fitting into this, this emerging view of cyberspace as, wow, you can go to this cool place online and you connect, you dial up into this thing and you're in this fantasy world with all these different people, but they're playing characters. Right. It's definitely this older vision of what the internet was going to be and was for a little while.
Completely. I remember logging into a MUD called, or I guess it was a Moo. It was called Hell Moo.
Okay.
And it was like this apocalyptic world. And there were maybe only 250 people on it, but all text-based. Everything was ASCII. And you would go into a room. It would be a map that would say northwest, east, south. And you could go into whatever room and then the map would change and just describe what was in the room with text. And then someone would come into the room and they were able to describe themselves however they wanted. Mm-hmm. Like it was like a dude wearing like an AC/DC shirt, carrying samurai swords, and like someone's face in his hand or something. I remember there was another part of the map. At a certain point, people could just create their own parts of the map. That was pretty interesting. It was colonnades that had crumbled on the beach, and clouds were breaking, and dark water was lapping up on the shores. It was really like written, and people had imagined the world. It wasn't just they were scribbling down like dumb shit. They really were imagining how the world that they wanted to live in might look. And to me, it was so eye-opening because that was the first time you really had no boundaries for like world creation. And yeah, that was pretty formative for me. I think I started going into sandbox games after that, or massive multiplayer games. But that was the entry point.
Yeah, I think Helmu was big on something awful for a while too. Like a lot of people in that forum got onto it. And that's one reason why it sort of popped off a little bit in the mid 2000s. And I think it actually just shut down only like a year or two ago.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, I was never on it, but it was fairly well known, I think. Yeah, it stuck around for a while.
Yeah, oh, that's funny. There was another one called Materia Magica that I played that was like a classic Dungeons and Dragons. And I also read a story that you wrote called Egregores.
Oh, egregore. Yeah, yeah.
That was a really well-written story. Just to summarize, but no spoilers, it's about a internet myth character named Jormus who survives through like message board lore and crosses the boundary of digital and like tactile reality. And it felt very real and reminded me of QAnon or like Slender Man, things that like have taken on this proliferation on their own and have broken outside of just the digital realm into the physical world.
Yeah, I find that stuff really fascinating. Yeah, you mentioned the QAnon thing. It's funny, I hadn't made that connection, but that's definitely real. This thing that's cooked up online and then finds its way into people's minds and manifests in reality that way, despite just being made up in the first place. But yeah, this story is it's set sort of in the recent past. And one thing about that is people had these little microcultures on forums. There'd be someone who was always annoying, but occasionally would say something really funny or would be right, and everyone would get really excited about that. There'd be certain phrases and things that got passed around that were used a lot. And forums still exist, and those kinds of spaces still do exist, but they aren't as common. And again, that's because the convenience of the alternatives was so much greater. Like, it was a pain in the ass to set up a forum on a domain and get hosting for it and do all this stuff and manage users and everything. And it's a lot easier to make a Discord and not have to worry about any of that stuff. But then you're basically ceding control of this community that you're trying to create to a corporation. And there have been examples in the last few years of communities set up on various platforms that have been taken down or that have been impeded because the owners decided that they didn't like what was happening there. And regardless of whether or not you think the content is like acceptable or not, the point remains that control has been like pulled away from users. And I think people are starting to recognize that, especially with what's happened to Twitter in the last little while, where it's become so clear that if you give yourself to a platform, that platform can turn against you really easily. And one person can effectively shape your entire experience of digital life. Twitter, a site can go from a place where you talk to your friends to somewhere where it's increasingly difficult to use. You're getting ads thrown in your face constantly for bullshit products that no one actually wants to buy. So there are trade-offs. And I'll be really curious to see if that leads to people either just getting offline more or creating alternative spaces like forums, again, where they have a little more control over what goes on them.
Wouldn't it be great if we brought back the forum era?
That would be so good.
Like not just Reddit, but the individual, like a
Yeah.
Neopets forum or something.
And forums are so antithetical to the current conception of the internet, right? Because as the internet moved from being, like this place or these collections of places where you go to a layer over reality, we've moved from being a bunch of different people in different places online to sort of being encouraged to inhabit one role and one identity. And that identity often is supposed to be your legal government identity that you have in day-to-day life. So that's all, and that leads to this idea of building up a reputation, building clout, influencers and all these things couldn't exist if there weren't these big platforms that let people consume their content. So you can't really be an influencer on forums, right? At most, you can be well known by people on an individual forum, but that's about it. And that's being known in a community, which is a very different thing from being known to thousands or millions of people in a way that's a little more like celebrity. But yeah, so for those reasons, I think people are like hesitant to go on forums because they're like, well, how am I going to build up my content and build up my brand? And it's, that's not what it's. And anyone who is like doing artistic or literary work or whatever, of course you do unfortunately need to do that work of marketing yourself. But it does mean that we don't get these more genuine spaces where people are just fucking around and not trying to become famous.
Yeah, going into the deep forests, I guess, is what some people would call it. It's funny because people now have gotten so familiar with how memes spread and how brands can like co-opt the meme that the memes that spread now seem to be insulated so that brands can't touch them. Like I was looking at the Josh Wine meme. No other brand can like hop on that because they would need to pay Josh or they would need some sort of licensing to get into the conversation. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of the same thing with TikTok using trending sounds. Like no brand can get on the sound without paying for it. And then you have to go through all this red tape to get to it. And I see that just happening more and more, that the things that really start to go viral are the ones that just normal people can interact with rather than a huge company making it their own.
Yeah, absolutely. And that in a way is the most cyberpunk thing of the last 10 years or so, unfortunately. This brands glomming on to social media as a way to spread awareness of themselves. That is very much, I feel like, a thing you would see in a cyberpunk novel, of just a brand being like, hey, I'm your friend. McDonald's is your friend. Hey, Doge. We all love it. I'm loving it. And it sucks. But yeah, cyberpunk sucked. A lot of it sucked. And the aesthetic was cool, but like the worlds were always really grim. And that appears to be what's happened. So yeah, the people finding ways to resist that, to either having these really specific uses of different media, or making things that are just so like retreating into absurdity and incomprehensibility, which use those little like images of like humor in like the 1980s or 90s, and it's just like someone telling a joke, and like humor in the 2020s, and it's just like this deep fried image of like complete nonsense. But I think there's like a reason for that. It's okay, we've realized that brands can just co-opt anything that is too straightforward, and now we've seen AI too can be used to generate stuff that is very like that approximates painting or whatever. What can't those things take? And often the answer is just like really outlandish, schizophrenic almost art and expression. Mm-hmm. Like I feel like AI can't generate the side of a Dr. Bronner's bottle, right? Like that kind of just complete insanity. So I think you see people doing more of that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's funny thinking about cyberpunk being written, and then are the people that are creating everything creating the future based on what they read in cyberpunk books? It seems the fiction is written and then it becomes reality, because the people that are creating the technology are like a lot of the time not that creative, and they think that's what the future is supposed to be. And cyberpunk world is cool, but it's like cool because it's noir and because
Right.
around every corner there could be like an adventure waiting for you. But that's not what I want my everyday life to be. It would be way too complicated.
Yeah, it's the don't create the torment nexus thing, right? Of that tweet from a few years ago of someone saying, "Oh yeah, in my book I invented the torment nexus as a cautionary tale," and then some tech companies like, "Oh, we finally created the torment nexus from the classic book. Don't create the torment nexus." Yeah, it's like the people in charge of the stuff have often a really superficial sense, like aesthetic kind of sense, I feel like, of these genres. And like you see this a lot with Musk, and he has a replica of the gun from Cyberpunk from the game on his nightstand. And then also he's really into the Culture series by Ian Banks. And those aren't Cyberpunk, but they're like far future space communist. And he names all of his ships and submarines after the ships in that series. And it's like all he sees is, wow, cool names. When those books are all about a multicultural, autonomous communist society in space. And so it's, yeah, these people aren't taking any of that stuff. They're just like, wow, that looks cool. And I think that's because when you become so rich, your world just becomes one of aesthetics because you're so removed from like material concerns. But I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thinking about Redacted Island, the reason that I started this was like I grew up in New York and there's just so much stimulation, and I have a lot of thoughts about how New York shapes people in very specific ways. It gave rise to Trump and it gave rise to like Epstein and all this. I don't see any sort of machine that could create that kind of person other than New York. And so Redacted Island is like trying to figure out the kind of counterbalance of leaving that society, exit maxing, and I think there are many ways to do it. Setting up your own LAN party for a weekend, I think, could be one of them. But it's funny to think about the people that are not connected to any, like, if you never touch money ever, what are you actually connected to? Like, you're just floating in your own orbit of like people that agree with you, and every idea is correct. And it seems like a very odd existence.
Oh, yeah. No, I agree.
I want to talk to you a little bit about using Twine and like interactive fiction, because I feel like you were at the forefront of that movement in maybe 2010 to 2015. Yeah, what was your experience with that?
Yeah, I fell out of that just because I realized that I hate computers. And I like computers, but I just don't like trying to make them do what I want them to. I was never like a programmer or anything, and I haven't really made anything resembling a game in kind of a long time. But yeah, Twine is a software that lets you make hypertext stories or essays or games or whatever you want to call them. And that's not really a new idea, right? Like it, in a way, it just sort of helps you make a website, because that's what a website is, right? It's a collection of links that go to other pages. And even before Twine, HyperCard was really big on the Mac. And there's a ton of classic interactive fiction games and related experiences that were made in HyperCard. But yeah, I think what happened was there were a few books and zines and things in the early 2010s that were promoting this as a really accessible tool for people who wanted to get into thinking about branching narratives and wanted to think about the possibilities for storytelling around that stuff. And so a lot of people got into it, which was really cool. Yeah, I got into it, I guess, around 2010, 2011. And I feel like it was like a hugely generative period. A lot of people were playing around with that style of narrative who hadn't done it before. A lot of people got into storytelling through doing that. The kind of range of topics and styles that people were working in was really cool. People were doing poetry like stuff. People were doing more traditional kind of interactive fiction, like the choose your own adventure books that were popular in the 90s. People were doing like really interesting deconstructive kinds of projects. And yeah, there were also a lot of people doing work on the tool to make it more accessible. And today, I think that you can just use it in your browser. You don't even actually need to download something, which is cool. But yeah, and so I ended up putting a book together that was strange But I don't know. I end up always doing these strange projects. Like the LAN Party is odd as well. But I put
I
together a book.
appreciate it. It's like you really cover every medium. It's tight.
Yeah. So the idea with the book, which was called Video Games for Humans, was that it was like, okay, how do you put an interactive fiction game in a book, aside from the idea of just actually doing a choose your own adventure thing? And actually, an acquaintance of mine, Ryan North, who does dinosaur comics and a bunch of other, he's written a bunch of stuff for Marvel. He has a few choose your own adventure books that are based on Shakespeare plays that are just incredibly well put together. Like they have stories within stories. It's very complex. But with Video Games for Humans, the idea was like, okay, so we're just going to put playthroughs of the games in the books. So you'll read basically the choices that the person who played it made, and then that person can also have commentary. So I'm not really sure what the equivalent would be in any other form, but it's like you're hanging out with this person and they're playing this thing and then talking about it. And yeah, we had a ton of really great people contribute to that. And it's crazy to think that book is almost 10 years. That's really wild to me. But yeah, I don't do as much of that stuff anymore. I occasionally will play around with something. I made something in like RPG Maker last year, and I still have kind of an interest in games and the stories you can tell with them and the experiences that people share with them, but I'm not focusing as much on actually trying to make them right now. I am mostly more into just traditional prose fiction.
Yeah, making games is like very labor intensive. I like around the same time made it wasn't with Twine, but it was a choose your own adventure game. It's called 1000 Days of Syria. And like during the Arab Spring, I was a reporter in the Middle East and snuck into Syria with some other journalists and talked to a lot of people and got a lot of like testimonials about what it was like there, and made like an interactive news game based on the different people that I met when I was there. And it was really like a new way of delivering information for me, using hyperlinks to tell a story and being able to like branch off into a Wikipedia article or have having like other characters that you're playing. If you play a different way through, meet up with other characters depending on the story branch tree. And it was like it was just like an experimentation in storytelling using historical data, really. And yeah, it did pretty well. Like people played it, and people still go back. It's funny looking at the Wikipedia links because so much has been edited since then. Like I would link to like generals that were leaders of rebel factions, and it's like completely changed, and their like allegiances have changed and stuff. It's fascinating, and that's going to be 10 years old in May, and it's just funny looking back on it, how much has really changed in the world and also in game design. I mean, I think like Depression Quest, like the thing that started Gamergate was using Twine, wasn't it? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And 2015 marks this huge, cultural shift. And at the time, I think people didn't really realize, but then that kind of spawned a whole bunch of other cascading changes in culture and opened up a bunch of different fronts in culture wars. And very weird to reflect on that now.
Yeah. Twine, I guess, was really the thing that brought us into this movement.
We've got to go back. We've got to stop.
Just go back to storytelling through Twine. Twine on forums. I think that's the 2024 move.
Hell yeah.
Let me ask you, how do you find inspiration to write all of these different short stories? Because they really span the gamut of what narrative you use and like what topics you address, and where are you finding your inspiration?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like I've been vomiting this stuff online for a while now, for a little under a year. And partly that was just for me as a way of overcoming my block around writing fiction. I think when I was doing Twine stuff, it sometimes felt like a bit of a crutch for me. If the writing isn't that good, then at least there's like this hook to it of like this can distract from that with the support of this interactive element. And I a little over a year ago. I was like, I just want to get over this. I've been wanting to do fiction for a long time, and I used to when I was in school until I had some not great experiences with teachers. And yeah, if I have an idea and it feels like something I can spin out into 2,000 words, then I'll just try and do it. I just write everything down too. Like whenever I hear something interesting, and I feel like a lot of people do this. If you hear an interesting anecdote or like a weird name or anything like that, I write it down because I'm like, and I have a file where I just leave all this stuff. So I just have a list of premises that I sometimes go back to, or like a list of little details that I can add into things. And it can be anything, right? It can just be like, oh, like I'm looking at my thing now and I'm like, oh, there is something called an organ of Valenciennes, and it's an organ in the nautilus animal, and no one knows what it does really. So I'm like, that's weird. That's interesting. That there's something there maybe. Or just yeah, little facts and details and things, and just building them out from there. Or things that have happened to me. I tend to write in the first person a lot, which I think can confuse people sometimes, because I'll share a story and not always say like, here is a short story that is fiction that I wrote, and it'll start off pretty normal. And so people will be like, wow, I thought this, did this happen to you? And people thought that the Dormus story was real at first until it gets to the point where it becomes pretty clear that it's supernatural. But that's the thing, right? It's like with a lot of this stuff, it's like some hook of something that is grounded in reality or that happened to you or that you can use, and then you spin it off into some weird place. Yeah, I don't know. I just try to, I think as someone who had and still has this self-consciousness about writing, the only way to get over that is to just keep doing it. And a lot of that you can do in private, but then at some point you just have to do it in public. And I submit stuff to journals as well, but it's like that takes so long. And maybe social media has trained me to want immediate gratification, which is not great. But also it's just nice to have a website. I feel like I didn't have a personal website for a long time. Like I used to like 10 years ago, and then I didn't for a while. And I have one again now. And I'm like, I can just do whatever I want on this. This is great. It's not Twitter. It's not Tumblr or anything. No one can take this from me. And more people should do that. I think just maybe we're going back to blogging too. Maybe blogging is coming back alongside forums. But I guess we'll see.
Yeah. Do you remember StumbleUpon?
Vaguely. Yeah. That was like a site like, or blog sharing kind of site.
Yeah, it was like a plugin, and you would just click it and it would just bring you to a random website on the internet.
Oh, yeah.
And it could be like anything. It could be like hamster dance. It could be like information on the Nautilus organ. It could be anything. And I kind of want to bring back that just absolute randomness, because there was no algorithm. It was just like, it was like rolling a 1,000,000-sided die.
Yeah, that's the thing too, is there are not fewer websites, but like fewer good websites to go to. There are like the main ones that people use, that people spend a lot of time on, and then there's just a ton of garbage. There's just so much bot generated stuff. There's so much SEO grabbing stuff. And Google really has a lot to answer for, I think, and like how they have shaped the modern internet.
Yeah, the in-shitification of the internet.
Right,
as Cory Doctorow has put it, that like basically a company starts, it's free, it's the best that it can be, everyone signs up for it, and then it's slowly, everything that makes it good is taken away, and you have to pay for just to get what you started out with. And,
right.
And it's just true with any of these like tech startups that need to make money. The only way that they can make money is by getting more people to sign up and pay more money. So
yeah,
it's not really a sustainable model. But going back to your writing, I really like reading stories in the first person. I think they're my favorite, just because reading in itself is a solitary act. And to read something in the first person, it is the most kind of arresting for someone to read. Like it really puts you in the mind of the narrator if it's in first person. And I also think that greatest strength that writing has over every other medium is that it has the ability to make people feel less lonely, because you do it by yourself and you are alone. When you're doing it, you're already in the state with which the medium is meant to be consumed.
Right.
And I think that your writing like just inherently nails that, which is Cool. Even the idea of the nautilus organ that no one has any explanation for. It's like a void inside of a body.
Mm.
Are you working on anything now other than LAN Party?
Yeah, I'm actually trying to finish up a novella right now. It's been a while in the making, but I'm hoping to have it. My agent wants to try to sell it within the next 6 months or so. We'll see if I can do that. But yeah, that would be my first long form fiction. So it's cool. I haven't really talked about it much publicly, and I try to avoid doing that just because I feel like when you talk about something before it's done, it can sap your drive because it sort of feels like you've done something. But
Yeah, totally. I completely agree.
yeah, just I guess very broadly, it's about climate change and also vampires and just sort of thinking about the long term, thinking about climate change and climate catastrophe in on sort of a longer scale. But yeah, hopefully that will be out or sold at least in the next little while, and I'll be able to say more about it then.
Nice. I love vampires. When I was in college, I had a radio station called Vampiric Disco that would play at 2 a.m. It was like pre-Twilight
Hell
movie,
yeah.
so it was like, yeah, it was fun. I would like text my friends at 2 in the morning. The candelabras are lit and the blood is flowing.
Yeah, I think they're having a bit of a moment again. It's one of those things that like a enduring cultural monster, and so they come and go and always represent different things. And yeah, I think we've sort of finally recovered from like the Twilight and True Blood era, and now we're getting a new wave of that stuff.
Yeah, bring it back to the Blade nightclub.
Yeah, the Blood Rave.
Yeah, that's iconic.
Absolutely.
That's tight. Do you have a title that you can share or no?
I don't have a title yet. Still working on that. I'm really bad with titles, so kind of hoping that my agent can come up with something.
I was talking to my friend Amy Rose Spiegel the other day, and I said
Oh
that I
yeah,
was going to be chatting with you, and she said that you work together at Vice, like she was your editor at Vice for some stuff.
yeah. She I think edited a thing that I wrote for Vice like years ago, and then more recently we were both in a music video for a friend of ours named Sadie Dupuy, who's
Tight.
in a band called Speedy Ortiz. And yeah, I think that was the last time I saw her before I left New York. But yeah, that was a lot of fun.
She really likes you. She said you were cool.
Yeah, no, I like her too. She's awesome. There's a lot of people I miss in New York. I'm up in rural Canada right now, but I'm hopefully going to visit in a little while and maybe move back, but who knows? It depends on if I can get a visa or not.
I feel like rural Canada is very peaceful, though. It's probably a great place to write a novella.
It is chill. Yeah, there's not a lot of distractions, I would say, which you can't really say the same of for New York. It's basically all distractions all the time, which is nice. It's nice to have things to do, but I lived in New York for 7 years, so this is a nice change of pace, a nice intermission, if nothing else. And we'll see what comes after it. I am really not sure right now. There's a lot of possibilities.
Yeah, rural Canada sounds pretty great, to be honest. I'm going back to New York 3 days, and it's always a love-hate thing. But if you want to come through, we'll get you a bed somewhere. I was just in Brittany in France and thinking about vampires. I'm on some druid shit right now. I was walking around just on the coast there, and the weather changes like all the time. It's going to be like cloudy, and then holes in the clouds will break, and there'll be like a ray of sunshine, and then a nimbus of like mist will puff by, and then like foam from the water will curl up and leave like this snow-esque tarp over the sand. And I'm just in awe of all this shit. And then I'm walking, and then I stumble across a druid graveyard. I'm like,
oh my God.
what? And yeah, druid stuff is wild. There's so little history about it. It was all oral tradition, and what's passed down is like the new age druidry I'm a little bit skeptical about, but I want to know more about like ancient druids.
Yeah, that stuff is fascinating. I started reading about chaos magic recently, which is, I guess it's like less invested in sort of ancient tradition stuff. But I was really into all that kind of stuff definitely over quarantine during the early pandemic. I just went down a rabbit hole online and was like watching Ellen Watts videos and just like listening to all this stuff. I was like, yeah, druids, man. Druids.
So explain to me in short form what chaos magic is, because I've looked into it, but I feel like there are a lot of different ways to interpret it.
Yeah, I'm still not really sure. I read this book called Condensed Chaos by Phil Hine that was written in the 90s and definitely shows its age. It definitely is talking about cyberspace and stuff like we were saying earlier. And yeah, I guess it feels a lot more like willing to sort of pick and choose. It's a lot more about belief too, about just, okay, if you believe in it, it works. Like it doesn't matter what it is. So they're more open to things like, okay, if you believe in ancient druid stuff and you can use, that's great. But if you believe in, I don't know, Gandalf, then if that's real to you in some way and you can use that, then that works too. So I think it's saying it's less about the tradition or the written down stuff or whatever, and it's more about harnessing your ability to believe in something to produce some kind of effect. I'm probably, anyone who like actually knows about this stuff is probably getting really mad at me, but that's my sense of it. So it's interesting. I know a few people who are into it, so I thought I would give it a shot and read some chaos magic stuff up here in the woods. Seems like a good place for it.
Yeah. Will it into existence. All right, Merritt. It was great talking to you.
Yeah, you too.
You have so many cool projects going on, and I'm going to order LAN Party. When does it come out?
I think in the US and Canada, it comes out on January 30th. And I think it might already be out in the UK at this point because the publisher is Thames and Hudson and they're in the UK. So
right on. All right, I'm going to buy it. Go enjoy the snowy wilderness. And hopefully you'll come to New York soon.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
Right on.